Hello, good morning, everyone. Sorry, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sanya. Here I am very pleased to welcome Shireen Hassan, and who will be presenting the title Introduction to Criminology, a Canadian open education resource, phases, funding, challenges, and recommendation of future OERs. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that introduction. Hello, again, my name is Dr. Shireen Hassan, and I teach at Kwantlen Polytechnic University. Kwantlen serves a region south of the Fraser River in British Columbia, which overlaps with the unceded traditional and ancestral lands of the Kwantlen, Musqueam, Katzie, Semiahmoo, Tsawwassen, Kakite, and Kwikwetlem peoples. Okay, so just a brief overview of what I'll be chatting about today. We'll talk about the various stages of this open education resource in criminology, beginning with phase one, the preparation phase, which involved the review of existing textbooks and also interviews with scholars in the field. Phase two, the planning phase, which involved developing a textbook outline and our call for authors. Phase three, which is the writing phase, and I'll talk a little bit about the authors that we had participate in this project, as well as the work of the editors and some chapter details. Phase four, which involved the development of ancillary or instructor materials. I'll also talk about funding, some recommendations, and a little bit about the feedback, impacts, and future OERs in criminology. So phase one, preparation. So the review of existing textbooks was conducted by a student assistant, and this work began in the fall of 2019. There were 19 course outlines from institutions across Canada for the course typically called Introduction to Criminology. In this review, the student provided a summary for all of the course descriptions, course objectives, and weekly topics. There was also a comprehensive review of the textbooks used in this introductory course, and it was found that the top 3 textbooks used were first, Canadian Criminology Today. Approximately 1/3 of instructors adopted that textbook, and it costs approximately $83. The second most typically adopted text is by Linden, called Criminology, A Canadian Perspective. And then in third place, we have Crim, Introduction to Criminology by Siegel and colleagues, which is around 11% of those textbooks adopted across Canada, and that one costs about $115. So you can see here that the average cost of an Intro to Crim textbook for this course is around $100 to $120 on average. So this review of existing textbooks and course outlines revealed some similar patterns, and the typical things that were found in these textbooks and course outlines included a discussion of patterns of crime and also the various ways that criminologists measure crime. It also included some of the classical theories of crime, including classical, biological, psychological, sociological. These were all kind of foundational aspects of these textbooks and these courses. In addition, all of them really talked about various crime categories and some statistics to teach students about how prevalent, for example, violent crime is, property crime, across the various provinces in the country. But what we were particularly interested in examining is the extent to which and the ways in which Indigenous ways of knowing were incorporated into the chapters. And what we found was that these textbooks and these course outlines really incorporated varied degrees of Indigenous content. Overall, there was a lack of Indigenous authors, a lack of trauma-informed, culturally relevant, strength-based Indigenous content. And so this is what we really set out to try to address in our OER. It really was not too much of a surprise, as we know that the discipline of criminology as a whole has traditionally been very Eurocentric. So the next phase, the next part of the phase one, the preparation phase, involved interviews. There was an interview with Dr. Lisa Monchlin my colleague in the criminology department at KPU, and some of you may know that Lisa is the first Indigenous woman in Canada to receive her PhD in criminology, and she's the author of the text, The Colonial Problem. And also another colleague, Lara Lisa Condello from the Nicola Valley Institute of Technology in BC. That's located in Merritt, and it's the BC's Indigenous Public Post-Secondary Institute. So the goal of these interviews was really to learn how to best approach the process of indigenizing the curriculum in this Introduction to Criminology course. And there were a number of recommendations that were made by my colleagues that were quite insightful. They encouraged us to guide the authors in examining justice prior to colonization, to ensure that they critique Western theories from an Indigenous perspective, and also to encourage authors to examine the socio-historical context to help students understand the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in the criminal justice system. Some other very insightful recommendations that were made that I don't have on the slide here included using Indigenous examples to try to flesh out these theories and bring them to life, to incorporate lived experiences whenever possible, to indigenize assignments and discussion questions, to incorporate trauma-informed literature, and also to have the authors address their own positionality at the start of each chapter, to tell the reader where they're from, how their own privilege or lack of privilege really shaped their knowledge and understanding of the crim theories that they were about to write about. And that's a really unique feature of this OER. So in phase 2 of the OER, the planning phase, this involved developing an outline. So following the review of the text and the course outlines and the descriptions, all of that work that was done, and these in-depth interviews, a team of my colleagues and I gathered to collaboratively develop an outline for the textbook, keeping in mind, the nuts and bolts that instructors would want to see in an introductory text of this nature, but also moving beyond what might be expected by incorporating the many recommendations made and by addressing the void that clearly exists in traditional introductory criminology texts. Namely, we wanted to incorporate, meaningfully incorporate Indigenous content and also collaborate with Indigenous scholars whenever possible. So here's a list of some of the KPU criminology colleagues that I worked with: Wade Deisman, Greg Simmons, Alana Abramson, Lisa, and Dan, and myself. Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars across Canada were recruited, and there were many different strategies that were used to try to recruit expert authors who are equally passionate about open education. I happen to be in a really unique position as the articulation rep of my criminology department. So I'm a member of a larger committee made up of articulation reps from each institution in Western Canada that has a criminology program. And I've been a member of this committee for a number of years now, so I've developed some really great relationships, and it turns out there's a lot of experts in that committee. So when I introduced this textbook as a project that we were working on in our department, I had a lot of people who were willing to volunteer and write a chapter for the book that had various areas of expertise. So that was an amazing opportunity to collaborate with colleagues in that way. What I found to be probably the most successful way to recruit authors. And then I also incorporated a very targeted approach by reaching out to colleagues that I knew were experts in specific areas within criminology. It's a very multidisciplinary field. And so I used somewhat of a snowball sampling kind of approach by, talking to one psychologist and who they know in their field that would also be interested in collaborating on the psychological explanations chapter, for example. We also had a call for authors meeting with a number of authors or scholars that seemed to be interested in participating in this project. And in this meeting, we talked about a lot of the recommendations that were attained in the interviews during the preparation phase of the project. And some of these recommendations included to include the KPU elder in residence, Lekaten, his perspectives, to prioritize Indigenous authorship and collaboration between Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars, and to connect Indigenous ways of knowing and being with criminological theory. More specifically, in this call for authors meeting that we had very early in this planning phase, which was actually, it was a Zoom meeting because we were, in the middle of the pandemic. It was the fall of 2020. And it was facilitated by my colleague, my Indigenous colleague and restorative justice expert, Dr. Alana Abramson from our department. It was a really very fruitful Zoom meeting. There were a number of different recommendations that were discussed in this call for authors meeting. And we guided the authors to ask themselves the following: what local Indigenous and non-Indigenous strength-based examples and initiatives and/or resources can you include in your chapter to help the reader understand the theory? Because traditionally, a lot of examples about Indigenous peoples have been based on deficits, and we wanted strength-based examples. What stories or lived experiences can be used to highlight parts of the theory? What critiques have been or can be raised by Indigenous scholars with respect to the theory? And then what discussion questions and/or assignments can be used to promote critical and decolonial thinking with respect to the theory? So we gave the authors in that meeting quite a list of to-dos, and we were very hopeful that they would submit chapters that incorporate as many of these recommendations as possible. So that brings us to phase 3, the writing phase. There were a total of 18 chapters, including the introduction, and a total of 31 authors. So some chapters had one author and some had up to 4 authors. And some authors wrote more than one chapter, so there was a lot of collaboration that happened. And there were 5 chapters with at least one Indigenous author, so that was wonderful. There were 3 editors, myself, my colleague Dan Lett, and we also had Leah Ballantyne, who's a Cree lawyer from Manitoba, and she provided expert Indigenous consultation and editing for this textbook, and that was a really important aspect of the editing and the quality assurance, quality control for the content of the book. And each chapter was reviewed, edited, and/or revamped by all 3 editors, so it was quite a time-consuming process, as you can imagine. I should mention that I had one author kind of write a really wonderful chapter, and a wonderful positionality statement, and I used that as a template to provide all of the other authors so that they had an example of kind of what we were looking for. Because it is quite challenging, as you can imagine, with 31 different authors to have any sort of consistency in writing style and organization of the chapters. So the initial deadline for chapters was February 2021, but as I mentioned, we were all in the middle of a pandemic and having to teach online, and some of the authors had never done that. So there were a lot of delays. Some were expected, some were unexpected. In the end, the final chapter was received in October of 2022. So some people were able to meet the deadline, others had to drop off for a variety of personal reasons, and then we had new authors come on. So it was really a process of recruiting and re-recruiting. It was very much an iterative process, to say the least. So let's look a little bit at how these authors incorporated the many recommendations that were made and the guidance that Dan and I provided as editors for the book. Some great examples here of what they did. In the What is Crime chapter, which is chapter 1 of the textbook, written by Sean Ashley from Capilano University, he developed the following discussion question: what are some of the differences that exist between the way the Canadian criminal justice system and Indigenous justice systems approach crime? In chapter 3, the median crime chapter, the author, Chantal Fauchier, wrote a critique of colonialism, stating that the media can be described as a colonial tool and source of narrative control that can represent stereotypes and misrepresentations of Indigenous peoples and other minority groups. In chapter 8, the sociological explanations chapter, again, Sean Ashley was the author there, and he did a wonderful job of linking sociological concepts to Indigenous principles of justice. He talks about Durkheim's book, Suicide, and he says it's particularly important and reflects well the Anishinaabe concept of Deben Dezawen, pardon me if I mispronounced that, discussed earlier, in that it emphasizes the importance of social relations as the source of well-being. I could go on. I have some other wonderful examples, and one that I was actually jotting down this morning when Darian was giving his keynote speech about two-eyed seeing. That's a concept that's discussed in the methods chapter of the textbook. That author, Wendelin Hume, who's Indigenous, states that it's the cooperation between the researcher and the researched that may lead to improvements in research methods and findings. And one important step in this cooperative process is understanding first what the communities to be researched already know and have. This culturally relevant information is crucial in the planning stages of all research projects. In chapter 2, one of the discussion questions that I actually use as a weekly discussion post in my class, can you think of examples of how your heritage may have granted or denied you privileges that others did not have access to? And this is a question that I'm always so fascinated to read the responses to this question. And I've actually had domestic students and international students chatting in response to this question and saying, that we actually have a lot more in common than we thought. In the chapter 9 learning theories chapter, it states that in Indigenous communities, the mechanisms of learning are different or experienced differently based on distinct cultural variations. And the author highlights the extremely important role that mentorship, learning by doing, deep observation and learning within communities has within Indigenous teaching and learning. And lastly, chapter 12, cultural criminology, the author notes that the struggles of Indigenous activists for recognition and decolonization have not yet been the subject of cultural criminological analyses. However, that does not mean the perspective cannot offer the tools to engage with Indigenous struggles for justice. So we can see here that there's a recognition that traditionally criminological theories have not always delved into or incorporated Indigenous knowledge, have not been applied in that way, but that there are certainly opportunities for that. Okay, so the next phase was the development of ancillaries. So one thing that I really heard in the call for authors meeting that we had way back in the fall of 2020 was, well, none of my instructors are going to adopt this if we don't have instructor materials, right? So the PowerPoints, test banks, because it is a fair bit of work to adopt a new textbook and start from scratch. So this leg or arm of the project was funded by the Justice Institute of British Columbia, and it involved the development of all PowerPoint lessons and test banks for each of the 17 chapters. I was the lead on the development of the ancillaries, along with Gurinder Mann and Avery Hulbert. So that was a really important part, because we've definitely seen the adoption rates skyrocket after these ancillary materials are made available. They're now accessible via BC Campus, and instructors can fill out a form and simply have the test banks provided to them. It's under restricted materials on the website, of course, because we don't want students having access to the test banks, but once the identity of instructors has been confirmed, and those test banks are made available. So in addition to the funding that the JIBC provided for the development of the ancillaries, there was funding from a variety of different agencies. That was actually a challenging part of my role as a project lead on this textbook, was kind of managing all of the different funding sources and figuring out who's getting paid by which source and keeping track of it all. So BC Campus, because Kwantlen faculty can't be paid by Kwantlen for this type of work. It's part of service work, it's part of our role. But KPU authors and editors could be paid by BC Campus, and then KPU was able to provide funding to pay external contributors and collaborators, right? So we're very blessed to have an OER office I learned in some of the earlier talks this morning that some of the authors had to take on the role of figuring out Pressbooks and learning how it works and doing all that work on their own, whereas you're very blessed to have an OER office, and I just simply had to provide the final version of the chapters in Word, and it was converted into Pressbooks, so thank you to the OER office. So there were grants that were provided by the OER office. We also have FAEAF grants, which is, Rajiv, you could probably tell me what the acronyms, Faculty Advancement and Excellence Fund. Yeah, Faculty of Arts, there we go. So all external authors and contributors, as well as Leah, our CRE editor and consultant, and the student assistant, they were all able to be paid through those funds. And then also I was very happy that the KPU Criminology Department supported the project in the form of honoraria for external authors that we had to recruit to replace some authors that had to drop off, and also to pay for our elder to participate in an interview. And his interview input was included in the introductory chapter of the text. Sorry, Faculty of Arts Excellence and Advancement Funds. I did write down the acronym, there we go. So some recommendations for future OERs. So, as I mentioned, 31 authors. Very interesting number of people to try to manage. I really strongly suggest that future OERs have far fewer authors. Somewhere between 4 and 5 authors would be ideal. I heard this morning it's a medical terminology OER that was developed, and it was 2 colleagues who really work side by side, and it almost sounded like they co-teach the class, and I thought, oh my gosh, that would have been amazing. Just having a really small group of people. Of course, they didn't have any time release, it sounded like, so I could see how that'd be really challenging if you have a heavy teaching load, which kind of brings me to my next point. Time release for the authors and editors would have made this project a lot shorter. Of course, we had the pandemic included there, so that is something to consider. But I also really strongly recommend that the time release start after submission of all chapters or after some form of staggered submission process, because the challenging thing for me was I didn't have any time release for this, but it was very difficult to predict when I should get that time release, because these chapters were all submitted months and months after the deadline. So I found myself kind of working off the side of my desk often or on my holiday time. So that's something that I would strongly encourage, is that we wait till all the chapters come in and then actually apply for the time release and sit down and be able to dedicate that time. Because you can imagine if you wait months between edits of each chapter, it's like you're almost starting all over again, right? It's hard to get that momentum back up again. I also think that the funding that's provided to each author be more than about $500 per chapter, because it was challenging kind of recruiting people with the time that it took to actually go through the various edits. It is a labor of love. Most of the authors are really happy to do it regardless, but I could see it being a lot easier to recruit collaborators if there was more funding for that time that they committed to the project. So how has the textbook been received? Well, our OER office was able to include like a feedback form in the fall 2022 draft phase, as well as the soft launch in the spring of this year. And students were able to, at the end of each chapter, provide some feedback of things that they thought worked well or things that they had difficulty with. And overall, the feedback was extremely positive. Students were very appreciative that it was free. They were happy with the length of chapters, because that's one thing in introductory crim textbooks, is that chapter lengths can be 40 plus pages, and that the reality is that many of the students weren't reading the chapters in their entirety. The chapters were, for the most part, easy to understand. We had a lot of interactive content included. We have audio-visual material that students could link onto. There's a glossary where you hover over the term and the glossary definition will pop up. There's a search bar. There's all of these wonderful features that you wouldn't get in a traditional textbook. Some areas for improvement included some of the language might have been a little bit difficult or too technical. I mean, we even felt that as the editors, Dan and I, that despite the various edits on chapters, there's just some that were a little bit more abstract for the first year level of student that we were getting. So, but you know what? Instructors can adopt and assign not all of the chapters in the book. They could pick and choose which ones they wanted to include in their curriculum. There's also an OER maintenance committee within the Department of Criminology. I was actually asked today, what's the process of maintaining it and editing it and updating it, I should say. And I was like, well, we just had the launch in September, so we haven't had to do that yet, but I'm sure it's coming. And that's part of the service work that we do as colleagues in the Criminology department. I'm sure many of your departments as well. Access, it's available in the World Cat Global Library Catalog, BC Open Textbook Collection. The adoption rates have been amazing. At KPU alone, over close to $50,000 in savings so far, and it was just launched earlier this year. And the potential at KPU alone is huge. There's a potential of $177,000 in savings at KPU alone in 1 year, based on the number of students that actually enroll in this class. There's a number of institutions that have had it become a part of their mandatory textbook adoption. Not all institutions have a mandatory textbook adoption kind of rule, but the Justice Institute does. Red Deer Polytechnic, I was told, also does. And I've listed off some other institutions, including Simon Fraser University. So the true impact and savings has yet to be known because it's still very new. Oh, I should mention, too, that one of the authors said to me, that they were doing a recruitment talk at a Law 12 class in a high school in Vancouver Island, and the faculty there had adopted the book so they could use some of the chapters for their grade 12 students. So I thought that was really wonderful because they were relying on a criminology text from the early 90s. So I was really happy to hear that. So future OER work. I'm working on a research methods textbook in criminology. Just started, but this one is not starting from scratch. It's an adaptation of an existing open access text in the States. So the goal is to Canadianize it and indigenize that curriculum. We've already, I should say the OER office has already converted it to Pressbooks. And when I'm on leave, partial leave in the spring and then on leave next year, hopefully, I plan to revamp each of those chapters, incorporating that Canadian content and Indigenous content and collaboration. So thank you, everybody, for your time. I'm just going to pop that up there. It's a poster that we created to highlight the key features of the text. It has links to the textbook as well as links to the ancillary materials, and I have copies of this poster as well if anybody would like to take one with them. And now I open it up to questions. I think I exceeded that 2-minute warning. I apologize. We're good? Okay. Are there any questions, comments?
Thanks for that great talk. You mentioned the value of limiting the number of authors down to, and we encounter the same thing when developing courses. More SMEs is more work. You get a lot of tracking people down. That being said, representation is important, and frequently the motivation behind having lots of contributors is to have diverse representation. Yeah. And I wonder if you have any comments on that tension.
On the tension.
The tension between striving for a small number of contributors in order to make things easier versus trying to have a larger number for representation.
Yeah, okay, so that's a really good question. So, I mean, criminology might be a bit unique compared to other disciplines. It's extremely multidisciplinary, so I can't have somebody who's not a psychologist write the chapter on psychological explanations, right? Or a sociologist writing the sociological explanations chapter. Somebody who is really well-versed in research methods, quantitative and qualitative, as well as Indigenous methods, to write that chapter. So by definition, I had to have multiple authors, right? 31 was just too much. So there's going to be a sweet number, I think, somewhere in between 4 and 5 and 31. I mean, and we had some of them were in the States, all across Canada, the time zone, just it was a really uniquely diverse. But yeah, like you said, the diversity is part of its strength, right? We have feminists, LGBTQ plus members who are writing feminist criminology chapter, and I needed that, and I wanted that, and that was a really important aspect of it. So it was okay that that chapter had 4 authors, right, that had various degrees of knowledge about feminist criminology. Yeah. I don't know what the magic number is. I have yet to determine. But like I said, Intro to Crim, very unique, very multidisciplinary. This research methods OER, like we're looking at 3 key people who, and all 3 of us have taught methods. One has been on the research ethics board. So because the knowledge isn't quite as diverse as trying to cover the entire discipline in one textbook, I think it'll be a lot more manageable in that sense. So the nature of the textbook and the content you're trying to cover is really going to determine the number of authors that's appropriate. Yeah. Totally. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, no problem. That was a long answer, sorry. Hi.
Hi. This question is very interesting. I am not a researcher myself, but I did contribute to an article during the COVID period at the very beginning, and we were like 70 writing together, but with very strict, it means we had to give facts on what was happening during the COVID pandemic and write not too much, and this may be an answer. We never met, we never made any webinars or video conference. It was a call by Aras Bozkurt from the Anadolu University in Turkey. And I'm just thinking that this may be inspiring to get a lot of contribution, but you know, very strictly ordered, not research articles, but more facts, or how could you contribute? But with, there were questions like, what date was the lockdown given in your country, etc., etc.
Right, so you're saying like if you approach your authors with really specific questions to address in the chapters, yeah.
Yeah, this could be a solution to involve everybody, but that this is readable and doable with a lot of people, because I fully understand it must have been crazy, and congratulations.
Oh, thank you.
This fantastic work.
Yeah, we put a word limit on each chapter, but of course academics tend to be rather verbose, right? So it was like a matter of like trying to shrink some of the chapters, and then, yeah, it was, and everybody has different writing style, and some chapters just have a lot of content to cover. Some areas of criminology have to really do it justice. This is going to be longer chapters, and yeah, so. But you're right. Having a specific kind of list of the nuts and bolts that you want to see in each chapter, or questions that you want the authors to address, could certainly help streamline the process.
You understand? It's just a way to really involve people, but maybe then have only 5 or 6 that write more, and the rest will be also recognized, as I said before.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Is that it? Good. Thank you so much.